All right, everybody ready? Okay, welcome everybody to our Authors on Tap reading series. I'm Kristen, and together with my business partner, Javier, who couldn't be here tonight because he's busy working on Printers Row Lit Fest, run Exile and Bookville, this beautiful bookstore located on Michigan Avenue in downtown Chicago. Tonight, we are beyond ecstatic to host Nick Flynn, author of This Is the Night Our House Will Catch on Fire, and he will be in conversation with Exile VIP Rebecca Makkai. Nick Flynn is a writer, playwright, and poet. His most recent books are This Is the Night Our House Will Catch Fire, a hybrid memoir, and Stay, Threads, Collaborations, and Conversations, which documents 25 years of his collaborations with artists, filmmakers, and composers. He is also the author of 5 collections of poetry, including I Will Destroy You. Nick has been awarded fellowships from the Guggenheim and the Library of Congress, and is of the creative writing faculty at the University of Houston. His acclaimed memoir, Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, such a great title, was made into a film starring Robert DeNiro and has been translated into 15 languages. Rebecca Makkai is the Chicago-based author of the novels The Great Believers, The 100-Year House, and The Borrower, as well as the short story collection Music for Wartime. The Great Believers was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, and received the ALA Carnegie Medal and the LA Times Book Prize, among many other honors. Rebecca is on the MFA faculties of Sierra Nevada College and Northwestern University, and she is the artistic director of Story Studio here in Chicago. We have, thanks to Nick for sending book plates and Rebecca for coming in to signed copies of both of their works, and we'll put that into the link, or you can visit our website, exileandbookville.com, pick up copies or have them delivered directly to you. If you have any questions for either Nick or Rebecca, please feel free to leave them in the chat, and Rebecca will field the comments and pass them along. And we encourage you to leave your cameras on, but please mute yourselves for the duration of the event. All right, time to get this conversation with Nick Flynn and Rebecca Makkai started. Rebecca, Nick, take it away.
All right, thank you, Kristen, so much. And Nick, welcome to virtual Chicago you're in virtual upstate New York, right?
I am, yeah. It's and I love Chicago. I mean, I spent a lot of time there over the years, so it's nice to even virtually be there.
Yeah. You know, what's really funny, as Kristen was introducing you and she was saying your book titles, I suddenly had this memory of you did this thing that most of us do when you have a new book out. You email your contacts about it. And you also do the thing most of us do when you can't use italics and put your book titles in all caps. So I got an email from you once that just all caps, the subject was, I will destroy you. And I was like, what did I do? What happened? And then opening it up and realizing, oh, this is a mass email. This is the title of his collection. But oh my God, the heart attack of like, I thought we were friendly.
I think I sort of knew what I was doing with that.
Probably, yeah. You definitely get people's attention because, yeah, people might not open up the email that's like, I have a new book out. So
yeah, that's true. Yeah, but they're going to open something that says, I will destroy you. Just for due diligence, just to know, what's coming.
This goes along in keeping with my plan for my viral marketing plan for my next novel, which is going to be to individually email everyone I know and say, I hope you don't mind. I based a character on you. You'll know it when you see it. You probably have to read the whole book to figure it out, but I hope it's okay. And then how could they not buy the book, right? And then hopefully
that'll work.
500 extra copies that way. All right. But okay, so speaking of the fact that you write poetry, the fact that you do this memoirs, you write plays, you do all this stuff. The thing that I want to start by asking you is the thing that I overarchingly admire most about all of your memoirs. And this is the 4th memoir, right? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. About all of them is the sort of hybrid patchwork playing with structure, nature of them. And I mostly teach fiction writing, but I have memoir students sometimes too. And they can get stuck, and as well as, well-published memoir writers, getting stuck in this kind of this chronology, right? This tyranny of chronology that doesn't really give any additional meaning or additional order to what happened. It's just this being shackled to the timeline. And all of your memoirs have, will just break into other points of view. In your first memoir, you suddenly have something like, it's kind of King Lear in the middle of it. And so your memoirs are often ones that I am recommending to students, asking them to look at what's possible, like just, break out of your shell a little bit. So I have like 17 questions related to that. I'm going to try to ask two kind of coherent ones. One question being, what is your relationship to timeline, to chronology, as you sit down to do this? Because I think that's where most people start when they're looking at memoir, when they're looking at memory, and maybe it is where you start, but it's clearly not where you end up. Right. So what is your relationship to time and narrative as you approach something like this?
Well, I mean, that's so interesting. I mean, time is like, one of the main things we're writing about in some ways. It's like, it's always sort of there. I mean, I think that was Faulkner's big thing, that is, everything was about time, right? All his work was about time. And about how the past is never the past, and how things keep coming back, and you circle back into them with your mind. With this new book, the timeline was really, it really did begin with one incident, and the incident was not really the fire. The fire wasn't the initial incident, our house catching fire when I was 6 years old, but telling my daughter, her asking me to tell her stories of when she was my age. When she turned 7, she said, "What was it like when you were 7? What did you do?" And I began telling her a story. And the story I began telling her was about the story of Mr. Mann, the man who lived in the woods behind my grandmother's. And it was like a fairy tale. He was a hermit, and he was in his 90s. And he if you went near his house, he would shoot you with a shotgun, and you couldn't, I was just fascinated by this man, by Mr. Mann. Mm-hmm. And I spent, when I was 7, the summer I spent, I spent the whole summer trying to get as close as I could to him, to get him to shoot me with a shotgun, to get him to actually see what that was like. Oh my God. And then as I was telling it like to her, it did hit me, like, and I've told that story before, like before I had a daughter, but it did hit me that like it was like a strange thing to do. Like suddenly, like seeing someone who was 7, like telling to someone who was 7, like who's so tiny. And I'm like, did I really do that? Did I really? And actually, then I thought, no, I couldn't have been 7. I must have been 12, like, because that seems like something a 12-year-old would do. Someone who's a little bit older. But then I looked, and Mr. Mann died that winter. That winter I was 8. So when I turned 8. So it was when I was 7 that I was like spending so much time. I was like, what was I doing alone in the woods? Like going toward a guy who has a shotgun, and then ended up breaking into his house, like breaking into a house and like stealing some things when I'm 7. Was just, and it all sort of hit me. I was like, because I sort of knew, I thought I didn't really have the time quite right. Or I didn't really think about it. I was a kid. I was a little kid, and I did this thing. But then when I realized I was 7, when I had a 7-year-old next to me that I was telling it to, I was like, that's a really strange thing to do as a child. So it sort of began that way. It began with that one scene and telling a story, and then the story getting complicated by time. I mean, one of the things that got complicated by was time. Was that, how could it possibly happen? How could I do that when I was 7? It didn't seem like something. Telling my daughter this story, like I had to make it clear to her, like, this isn't something you should do. You shouldn't go break into houses. I mean, that's not a good thing to do, to break into a house of someone who may have a shotgun,
Yeah, it's very kind of.
But then I know you have kids also, and the fascinating thing about someone at that age at 7 was she made me tell that story 200 times. Like I told the story, she kept just saying to me, like, tell me the story of Mr. Mann. Like tell me that story again. And then she went to school, and I would tell her, I didn't tell her at first that I'd broken into the house. I just told about this interesting guy. I didn't say he had a shotgun at first, but then after like the 25th time, I told her about the shotgun. Then after the 50th time, I told her about breaking in. And then
No
she would
wonder
go
she
to,
kept asking you. It got better and better the more she asked you. I mean,
I know why, so why wouldn't she keep asking? Because
yeah.
I was holding back some things. I just, and then, but then she would go to the schoolyard and tell people about this story also about, me breaking into a house and all this stuff. So it became a little complicated in the schoolyard. Yeah, that I was the dad who had broken into a house. So.
That's fantastic. Well, there is something I think about, there's a reconfiguration mentally around childhood trauma. It doesn't have to be that you become a parent, but when you are old enough to look at how young children really are, or really
Yeah.
seem from the outside, and maybe we're missing half of it because they know that they're more mature than we think they are, right? But I know for me, I was today, and I won't get into my own childhood, but I was watching my 10-year-old run through the sprinkler, and I was like, oh my God, she's a little kid. And I'm thinking about, various traumatic things that I was living with when I was 10 and going, oh my God, this is,
Yeah.
I knew, but there was just a lot of mental calculation going on there as I'm standing there, pleasantly watching her go through the sprinkler, just the stuff starts reeling about.
It's this really beautiful summer experience of your child jumping through a sprinkler and then like transporting you back like in a wormhole back to when you're 10 and something, there were probably pleasant experiences there too. You probably, there's a pleasant experience and then suddenly it also becomes complicated,
Yeah.
And then I wonder, I do worry, like, is there something like, what will be the trauma of her life when she looks back at it? Like, and I can't think, it doesn't seem like she's had a traumatic life to me.
Yeah.
But maybe we'll see, this time yet. Yeah.
Right. And I think this is another reason that the achronology of a book like this resonates so much, is it's not, you didn't have, so just to be for people who have not read the book yet, there was a house fire when you were a kid. As an adult, you have this realization that your mother likely set the fire on purpose, endangering you and your brother. But something like that, the way that the meaning changes, the way your interpretation changes over time, the way that it changes as you tell it to different people, the way it changes when you look at a kid who is the age that you are, is this incredible layering that I think that there would be a huge disservice done to that kind of texture by trying to tell this in some linear fashion, right?
It is about, like these central moments in our lives that I think a lot of memoirs have. They have that thing, there's, we have many of them, but there are these sort of certain watershed moments, and the fire for me was one of them. But it just seemed like one of them just because it is like in, when you have a house fire, that's like sort of one of those big top 10 things, that affects you. You lose your job, you get divorced, you have a house fire. Like those are the, big ones. Someone dies. But so I just, in some ways I assumed it was just that, but then, circling around it, like it really needed to be circled around and pulled from all these different perspectives. Like it really needed to. So it is like the central thing in the book, but I just kept circling around it, telling it from, what my daughter would think about it, what it would be like to be that age, what my mother was thinking at the time, what her boyfriend was saying, who was with her at the time, who's the one who told me years later that she had said it. And just what it means, like what the archetype of fire means, and why that's, this element, there's a central element to the book that goes through it. Like in another book of mine, another Bullshit Night in Sex City, that's a very like watery book. Like it's very, I'm living on a boat on the ocean. It's very like wet, that book. And this book is very, is very, part of the book takes place in a salt marsh. Like that was where I'd go for refuge. And part of that is because the salt marsh is where you're safe. You're not going to burn on a salt marsh. You're not going to, there will be no fire, and you won't see, and you'll see anyone coming for, because it's a flat open space. So no one can surprise you in this space. So that became another landscape. That became like the sort of the central landscape after the fire was like the, like once Mr. Man died, I think, then I moved into the marsh,
That's amazing.
And those places were all places, those were the 3 trips. Like that with my daughter just worked out when she was asking me the story about Mr. Man. when she was 7, that May, I was home. I was, from my teaching, my wife was out working, and I had a gig in Boston and no childcare. So we went for a road trip. So we drove to Boston. Boston is near where my hometown is. So we went to my hometown. I said, oh, I can show you Mr. Mann's house. Let's go see the house that I've been telling you about. Because now it's a museum, which is another crazy, coincidence or just circumstance of the book, that this place that I went to as a child is now a museum. So we can go back in and see the things, and we could look for the stuff. What I stole was a little scroll, a paper scroll of, it was his books, were these serialized stories from the newspaper that he would cut out a column of the newspaper, then stitch them together, and that would be the book, that would be the story. So this was a Dickens story that Nicholas Nickleby. So I went in, I saw these little boxes, I opened the box, I saw a scroll. I took the scroll because it had my name on it. It said Nicholas on it. And I brought it home. And then this was 50 years ago. And then when I was telling it, my daughter, all she wanted was a scroll. She said, do you have the scroll? This is like a mythic object. This is totemic. And then I actually found the scroll. After the book came out, I have located the scroll in a crazy little box with weird little things, like a little old padlock and a key and there's the scroll sitting there. So I do actually still have the scroll, which is insane to me. I have no idea how I still have the scroll. So
that's so cool. That's so cool.
Now, but I found it so much after, she was excited about it. She doesn't really care about it anymore now.
Right. Right. Because our kids are the same age. They're young teenagers, right? It's
She outgrew the obsession with Mr. Mann and the scroll.
Yeah. Has your daughter read your work at all?
She's read poems. And she's read chapters. I have photographs of her. She'd go to bookstores and and I have a photograph of her in a bookstore reading one of my memoirs, The Ticking is the Bomb, with a friend. And she took the book down, was opening it up, looking through it, and there's a chapter called Sheep Fucker in it. The two of them were just she was young too. They were just cracking up, that there would be a book for this. So, she's looked through them. She's looked through them. I don't think she's read them completely. No.
Yeah. One of the merciful things I think here is that when children get old enough to, read something like this, they're so uninterested in us that
At some point, maybe they'll get interested, when they're, in their 40s or something. And,
I'm sure that's it. Yeah.
Maybe maybe not, Lord knows.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. I think it's, like I say in the book, I actually say part of writing the book is to sort of let her know who I am.
Yeah.
And to let her know where I'm from, what my childhood was like, and what, so because that's where she's from in some way, which is something that my mother, who was, wonderful and wild and reckless and brilliant and, all many things. But she didn't talk about her childhood at all. She didn't. I don't know the house. I don't know the house she grew up in. I don't know where she was a child. I can't picture it at all. And even though I know she grew up in a town that was maybe 20 minutes from the town I grew up in, and we would go through that town, she just never said let's go see the house I grew up in. Let's go see it. So yeah.
That's amazing. One thing before, I'm going to ask you in a minute to read to us, but before you do that, one thing that I'm thinking, just in regard to this whole idea of, you're talking about, you need to see this one event from all these different angles. And I'm thinking back on this image that you have kind of early in the book, that you're talking about how in space, fire is an orb. But it's the gravity of Earth, or the atmosphere, whatever it is of Earth, that gives it its shape within our atmosphere, which is not something I'd ever thought about before.
I'm not completely sure that's even true. Just to say, I heard that from a poet, the poet Jamal May.
Oh yeah, he's smart. He's real smart.
Oh, he's brilliant, but he's also a poet, though, and so poets are notoriously unreliable. And it's just a beautiful image that, can there be fire in space? there's no oxygen, so maybe there can't be.
The sun is fire in space. Stars are fire in space.
Oh, look at you. You're right. Okay. And they are orbs. Okay, so yeah, I guess he's right. Yeah.
Aren't you guys all glad that you came to Writers trying to discuss astrophysics? Because this is really a great use of your Thursday night. Like, well, okay, whether or not it's technically true, and I think it is.
Yeah.
That image works so well for me as sort of a, we'll talk about metonymy and synecdoche in a second possibly, but a sort of a metonymic image within the book, for the book itself, this idea that, chronology would give this a shape. Would have the gravity of chronology would give this sort of maybe a more expected shape, a linearity that would actually not be getting at the essence of what you're really writing about, which is spherical in some fundamental way, right?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think my first memoir is, Another Bush in Like City is a very linear book, actually. It maybe does not look like a chronology, but it is a classic, like, Aristotelian structure where you get in the train.
That's true, yeah.
The characters are introduced, you get to meet the characters, and then the crisis gets introduced, and then the crisis deepens, and then there's, the characters meet at a certain point, and then the crisis deepens, and then there's a resolution at the end. Whereas this, I think since then, I haven't done that structure. Like, I think that structure worked for that book, but since then, it does seem more like, I like to make these little planets, that are like sort of like where the images are all around the surface of the planet, and then you grab onto one and you follow it more deeply into the center, and you try to get to the center of the planet. And in the center, it's just a mystery. Like, in the center, you don't really know. In the center of this book, there's a mystery. I think there's a mystery to the center of every memoir.
Right.
A basic mystery. Like, I don't know. I don't know if my mother set the fire. I'm fairly sure she did. If she did set it, I don't know why she set the fire. We speculate on it in the book. The various possibilities, some of which are, I would say, that I admired some of them as being audacious or ingenious in order to get insurance money, and some of which, sent me into a tailspin of therapy, imagining those things. So, but you'll never be one answer. There's no one can answer that question.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, it's interesting because as a reader, you have that impulse of following it because it's a mystery, as you would with any mystery, but you don't ever expect, there's no promise of an answer. I think we know from the beginning, you're not going to go back in time and solve this. You're not going to be able to ask her, you're not going to suddenly discover video footage of this. There's, so we're digging inward, but I think with you just kind of exploring possibilities of what might have happened, and that same forward momentum that any mystery has to it, but with without the promise of resolution, and it still works. It's interesting to me.
It's interesting. It is kind of like a structure, like the Great Believers, in a way, in that it goes back in time, and then there's sort of the resonance of that, what was happening. Yours is like the 80s and mid 2005 or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it was 2015, or I think
2015 actually. Yeah
2015. Yeah, so it really gets to be right, almost in the present moment. And how the stuff that happened back then, it's just keeps echoing through time,
right?
And it's sort of that is what life is. That you have these things that happen to you when you're younger, these people you meet, these experiences you have, and how both those things are happening in parallel, which is the structure of your book, of the Great Believers, which I really loved also, to have that structure and to be bouncing back and forth between those and toggling, where each was always, the future wasn't present to the people in the past, but the past is always present to the people now. So
right. Yeah. It's something I might be mangling this, but there's a quote that I'm 99% sure was Tennyson, right, in a letter talking about his own work. And I can't remember what poem he was talking about, but was one of his long epic kind of narrative poems, explaining it. And he said, I dipped him into the stream of time and took him out on fire. And wow. And wow. I saw that, I was a college student, I was in the British Museum, and this letter was on the wall in his case, and I wrote it down and was like, that is my artistic thesis statement. So I already took myself very seriously as a writer at the age of 19. Lord knows what I was writing, but I was like, that's it. That's what I've been trying to do. That's what I want. That's what I'm getting at. I need to actually track down what the actual exact quote was.
That's so exciting. It's so strange too. It's very so poetic. Like you're not really sure what it means. I mean, I was
Yeah.
I didn't come across that when I was writing, so I was sort of like immersed in sort of fire mythology and fire, Gaston Bachelard, the psychoanalysis of fire, and
Yes.
other texts that sort of like wrestle with the concept of fire. But I didn't come across that one. I like the Jean Cocteau quote. If you were when asked what he would take from his house if it was on fire, he said, "I'd take the fire."
Oh, I think about that one for a while too. Like,
we don't know what that means. Like, what that means, he would that's the thing that's valuable, or he would save the house by taking the fire out of it.
right. I would remove the fire. Yeah.
It's really hard to say what he's saying,
Oh my
but I just
God.
love that. Yeah, that's the important thing, is the fire.
Oh my God. Well, before we get too much further here, I would love it if you would read to us a little bit from the book.
I will
get a taste of it or a revisiting.
Yeah, I'll read a little passage. I had a couple queued up. I think I got to go to this one. I'll just say a little something about it. This was at some point in writing the book, I sort of had when I sort of became aware of the fire, and my mother, I'd been aware of her setting the fire for a long time, but I hadn't had my child next to me, and sort of, and there's something about that, and just where I was in my life with, struggling with my marriage, and my daughter sort of just sort of asking these questions about when I was young. So I sort of had what you might call like a complete breakdown. So this is sort of trying to capture that moment. In that it did, it lasted a little while, but I'm better now. So I'll read a little bit of this. We landed in Florida. This is called a chapter called The Book of Splendor. We landed in Florida the night before. In the supermarket on the way to the motel, I stood before the chips. So many choices. My mantra was, hold it together, hold it together, hold it together. Now, over my head in the warm, warm Gulf, my mantra is, please help me, but I'm unsure who it is I'm talking to. A turn hangs in the air above me. Will I come back from this, I wonder? Have you ever actually been here, comes the answer. On the plane from Brooklyn, I'd been reading the Kabbalah. In the beginning were only two books, the Book of Creation and the Book of Splendor. One was about what we could see, the other was about what we could feel. One was about a God who could be known, the other was about a God who would be forever unknowable. This was the 2nd century, and this was enough. A wave breaks in my face. That night, in our motel room, my daughter and I watch a movie about an astronaut stranded on Mars. He spends his time making little videos of himself, which he transmits back to the rest of us stranded here on Earth. At one point, when it seems he will be saved, he tells himself, or us, or God, I'm really looking forward to not dying. And then his potatoes died. That's all I remember of the entire movie. I woke up this morning and thanked no one. My dreams dissolved in my mouth like salt in the ocean. I'm treading water. The air is overheated. This morning, my daughter hit me with a stick. We are from a place formed by ice, I told her, as I broke her stick over my knee. Lord, fill our eyes with seeing and our minds with knowing. Later, I'll be face down in the sand. My hands will form a small bed beneath my face. I'll close my eyes and see the glacier coming. A doctor held my head when I was born. My mother kissed the top of it, still wet with her. The Book of Creation has been with us all along, while the Book of Splendor was begun just yesterday. Each day we are offered a chance to add to it. Does this mean there's a God somewhere whose medium is words? And by the word, he created all that surrounds us. I can understand a world made of words. I do it all the time. I'm doing it now. I'm not floating in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm not asking for help. Where in this world made of nothing? Where is this world made of nothing but splendor? Help us to see wherever we gaze that the bush burns unconsumed.
That's
I'll just
amazing.
leave it at that.
Yeah. Something that's bringing up for me, actually, before I ask my question, I'll say, I see we already have one great question in the chat. And if people want to tune me out while I'm talking and type more questions, then in 5 or 10 minutes or so, we'll get to some of those. Something that's bringing up for me, I'm here just because you were talking about all the water imagery, and then I'm hearing the water stuff in here. I think as a poet, it strikes me that you have, and either it's an eye on consciously or just a subconscious inclination towards building the kind of echo chamber of imagery within a work so that things repeat, things resonate. And that's something that as a fiction writer, once in a while it happens and I'm like, oh yeah, I have a lot of green stuff in this book. I don't know why, I guess I'll keep it. But as a poet, I think, certainly you're much more practiced in that kind of, building that echo chamber of stuff. How, as you're looking at something as long as a memoir, how are you deciding what the core image is? I mean, obviously fire, like that's a given in this case, but the other images that repeat, the other motifs, the other themes that feel very carefully chosen, and that then, weave their way through. Or I'm even thinking back to something like, I mean, just to give a really obvious example, your third memoir, right? The Reenactments was your third. You basically have 3 main strains there. One of them is the glass flowers in the Harvard Natural History Museum. And you just return to those again and again and again and again and again. So that's a big, chunky, obvious one, but you have these much kind of finer grained images repeating in here. How do you make those choices? Does it happen and then you recognize it as it's happening? Is it?
So it's very funny because I'm teaching this week. I'm teaching for the Fine Arts Work Center. I don't know if you've ever taught there.
No. Tell them I want to. I like Provincetown.
It's less fun because we're doing it virtually now.
Oh yeah.
Usually it's very fun because we're all there in Provincetown.
Right.
And some of my writers are here tonight, which is great. And so we're talking just about this question is perfect for us. We did an exercise yesterday where I had people just go in and sort of like, if I just said to you, think of a body of water, like some body of water, like what would you see? Like you might see a lake. I know you have a connection to a lake. My main body of water is a salt marsh. Like that just is like my landscape, or that might be my landscape or something. But if I said like a relative, like or someone close, a blood relative, someone would come to your mind like at that moment. It's sort of trusting that, and so that becomes the closed image system of a piece like this. It becomes that like it can't be populated by, I sort of do limit it. Like there can't be that many characters in it. There has to be, because the more characters for a book like this, the less deep you'll go with each one.
Right.
I think, or just and I do find like returning to them, returning to the images does release surprising things. I think I saw that first in Bullshit Night when I was doing that. Like I didn't sort of have this idea, but I did do it a couple times, and one of them was this image that just always sort of was central to that. The first time I saw my father asleep outside, he was sleeping on a bench in Boston by the Esplanade, by the Charles River. Big public place, a lot of people having picnics and things. And I was riding my bicycle, and there was my father. And he was, the last time I'd seen him before that, he was getting evicted from where he lived. He said he was going to go live somewhere. So I saw him, and then I just described the scene. I say, there's people there. There's a little girl points. And then the next time, and I go back to that. I go back to that scene, like, and it's how I sort of knew it had to be like, maybe that's in the first third of the book, and then the second third of the book, there'll be this, and then the end will be returning to that scene. And the second one, it just sort of says it again, like my father's sleeping outside. I sort of talk about it, sleeping on that bench, and I describe the day, how it was. And then the third time, which is the time that really writing it sort of tickled me because it was so perverted, it was so twisted. I just say, that fucking little girl, like because she pointed at him. And it was just like, so like, it brought me such pleasure to it. It was so inappropriate. It just felt like what emotion is like. It seems like emotion is just always, it's just like this quicksilver thing that doesn't really attach to. I mean, the logical or the sensible reaction would be maybe sadness at my father there, or anger at him, but to point to some little girl that points at him and be like, be furious at her. It just made like an emotional sense to me in the writing of it, that it's still sort of, it seems to ring more true that if I said, I was, how did I feel? How did I feel when I saw my father like that? I felt like angry at a little girl, that made more emotional sense for me. So, and that was an image that sort of spread out through the whole book,
Right, the repetition of that, because I think if you'd done it all at once,
it wouldn't make sense.
Belaboring the point.
Yeah. And also, and that's the pleasure. I was telling some of my writers today, like, you can take an image and you can break it in half, and sometimes that creates more energy. Break it in half and then put it, 30 pages later, so that we remember the image and it comes back to us, and then when it comes back, there's been all this time in between, and it's deeper now from that time that you spent like away from it. Or you can take two images, you juxtapose them and bang them together, and that creates another kind of energy.
And that's something that you don't have unless you're going to write an epic book length poem. You don't have in poetry that spread, right? You're I mean, you write normal length poems, but like they tend to fit they fit in the New Yorker or whatever. So I mean, that was something you must have, you figured out, you learned as you took on the long form.
Well, but I think people even notice, like, if you read people's books of poetry, like, you'll see, like, wow, there's a lot of mud in this book.
That's true.
And
that's true. If you're looking at
usually the writer will be like, oh, there is? Like, I didn't know. But like, there's like, you use the word shadow like 20 times in this book. You use the word mud. You use the word, there's a lot of fish in this book. There's no cats. Like we do, I think it just naturally does happen, even in a book of poetry, but it's not as, it's not telling a narrative, so you don't notice as much, that you'll notice if you read it closely, it'll rise up. But if you're telling a narrative, then you are actually landing in these places again. When you land, then you see it again, you're holding the same object again,
Right. Yeah. That is interesting. Because I was thinking of individual poems, but when you hear someone read a series of poems, or you take the whole collection, you definitely have those. Yeah.
And I think it is that thing. If you ask someone, like, what's your landscape? Like, someone will write about a mountain a lot, and someone will write about the prairie. I was with a friend in Minnesota. I told this story before, and we were driving for the first time. He lived in the middle of the state, and we were driving from Minneapolis to his house. And he looked around, he goes, "Isn't this the most beautiful landscape?" And I looked around, I was like, "There's nothing here. Like, what are you talking about? There's absolutely nothing here." And to him, it was like the most beautiful landscape. I could not see what he could see. Wow. And that really comes from who you are, clearly. Like, my landscape is like a salt marsh. I'm sure a lot of people would be like, what are you talking about? It's like a wasteland. It's like a wasteland of like smelly fish,
Yeah. That idea too of, you don't really see a lot of your own themes until someone else points them out to you. That's such a trip, I think, for any writer. You're used to the idea, I think, by the time you have a book out, that people are going to like or not like certain things. They're going to have their own read, they're going to respond, but what you're not necessarily totally braced for before publication is the way that people will tell you things about yourself that you didn't know. And that's
Agreed.
And it can be something very tiny, right? Or just like, you sure like this one word, but it could also be
it can be life-changing. The great poet Carl Phillips, I was in the first workshop he ever took in Truro. The great poet Alan Dugan would just have like a round table where we'd sit around, like, and young poets would come and just sit there and put like $5 in a hat or something, and then you'd read a poem. And Carl Phillips showed up one day, and he'd never shown a poem to anyone, and it was so clearly a homoerotic poem. And at that time, he was married to a woman, and it was really like, "Oh, you're gay." And he says it himself. He says he was outed by his own poetry. Like, he did not know it to himself until he wrote the poems, and the poems clearly, to anyone who read them, was like, these are homoerotic poems. These are,
Oh my God.
Yeah. Then after his book came out, he came out as gay.
Yeah, that's how I don't think I
Yeah.
ever knew he was married to a woman. I've only known this
He was
story.
straight when I met him. He was straight when I met him.
Wow, wow. There's a wonderful Richard Russo short story called The Whore's Child that is about someone teaching a creative writing workshop, and there's a nun in the workshop who's writing about her own childhood and ends up writing things that everyone else in the workshop can kind of interpret what was going on with her mother, but the nun doesn't see it. It's fascinating in that sense.
Yeah. That's great. What's it called? Do you know what it's called?
It's called The Whore's Child, like WHORE. Yeah.
Wow, that's intense.
Yeah, it's a really good story. I make my I teach pedagogy partly. I teach creative writing pedagogy at Northwestern, and I make my pedagogy students read it as some of the stuff that comes up where you're like, I know stuff about your life that you don't know based on what you just read for me. We have one question in the chat to start with that I'm going to ask, and I would really invite everyone else, anything that is about this book or Nick's other work in general, anything on your mind would be great to type in there. The question is, because fire has been such an intensely important occurrence in your life, have you found that the out of control wildfires happening due to climate change, have you found them triggering? And would you consider writing about them somehow, or are you content to stay in the seat of family history for your inquiry while writing?
Well, it does. I mean, the Paradise Fire did make it into this book because it was, happening while I was writing. So it definitely made it into the book in a chapter in a moment. And also, there is a chapter also where there was an object, this sort of cathectic object from my childhood, which was this cathedral that was plastic cathedral my grandmother would take out every Christmas and plug in, and it looked like Notre Dame, and you'd plug it in and it would glow. It'd sit on a table. It was made out of this creamy plastic, and it would glow and it would play Silent Night if you wound it up. And you can still find them online, which is amazing. I looked them up and you can still get these used ones. Maybe I'll get one, but they're kind of huge. So, it's one of those things that it means a lot to me, but I'm not sure if I will actually ever buy one. But that object, it has this resonance for it because it was something that from my childhood. And then it was also like, it looks like a house on fire because it's like glowing from the inside. And then while I was writing it, Notre Dame burns. And so, that sort of came into it also at that thing. But yeah, like the fire, it wasn't really triggering for me personally. I don't think the wildfires out west. I mean, just a huge tragedy of this world right now, of where we are in the world is certainly part of it. I did think, like, writing a book called "This Is the Night Our House Will Catch Fire." I mean, it has just the syntax of the title is suggesting that we know something's going to happen. Usually a house catching fire is, you don't know what's going to happen. You can't say tonight our house is going to catch fire. If you say that, then there's a problem. And so, but now we're living in a place where people maybe could say that, like, you look around, where you're living, like, this could be like,
Right, the fires are encroaching. They're coming down the valley.
That syntax could be something more common, which is it's a strange syntax for a book, and now, but it's now maybe more common. Yeah, I mean, it's a really hard thing. I mean, like today the heat here in upstate New York felt like 104 degrees, which is just insane. It's just insane heat. So already,
it's that's interesting. I mean, sorry, I was about to say something much less interesting than the question in the chat box. So the question in the chat box is, can you talk more about how you pair or find the action of motion of the scene with the internal drives of your character?
This is one of my students this week. And so, hi, Natasha. How you find the action of motion of the scene with the internal drives of your character. I think just by what people do and what they look at and what they choose to focus on really reveals what their internal drives are. So wherever your attention goes, we've said this before, like most of our memoirs, something bad happened. I mean, that's sort of like the definition of the memoir, like something bad happened and then we're we somehow made it through and figured out, someone died, someone we loved died, something, some situation, there was some terrible situation. But all the stuff that is happening parallel to that happening is what is really interesting also, like that there's the world going on and what you look out the window and see, and what you have to do, the mundane stuff you have to do just to sort of, this is the central disaster, and then there's everything you have to do around that disaster. And that should have, or has as much importance, I think, as the central thing. And part of that is just because the readers can't take in too much of a huge tragedy. Like it's just too much to take in. There has to be a place for them to breathe and for them to be in a recognizable universe where everything isn't a disaster. So that's all I can say is like that. Just spending time, like even talking about if someone is in a bed dying, like spending time describing the room or describing what's happening outside the room, or what you had for breakfast or what you're thinking of doing. All those things that you look at are going to reveal like the inner life of the character. Because that's what they're maybe denying what they have to do, or maybe that's what they need to do, or that's like what they really choose to do. That's what is giving them comfort, like anything that they're choosing to do. And then describing that with as much care as you do the central tragedy, I think.
Yeah, I'm thinking even of like, the scenes that take place inside the grocery store where your mother worked, and you have yourself in there, looking at this, like the sugary cereals, and like it's very much what the kid would notice. And you're actually giving your mother a point of view in these sort of italicized sections that, what she notices is completely different from what you're noticing in your point of view. It's
that's a little like fictive, like the drifting into fiction. It's I'm getting dangerous territory in my memoir. It's like entering into the internal landscape of those that aren't me. But I think we sort of have to in some ways. I don't have to, but I do it. I do it mostly just with people who are blood relatives of mine, because I feel like we have the shared DNA and we have the same, we're so close, that, I can imagine it much closer. The further we get away from that, for me, the more mysterious it gets. So I don't really enter into the consciousness of yet, but because then I'll be a fiction writer, then I'll end up being a fiction writer.
It's not worth it.
but that, like, I mean, I'm really wildly impressed with the great believers, like entering into like, this gay male milieu of the 1980s, just completely occupying it in this amazing way. Like, it's really impressive. Like, I'm like, wow, that is bold to do this, to go into like a whole nother milieu and like, I'm gonna occupy this and just own it. Yeah.
Well, occupy sounds kind of militant, so, but I know what you mean.
I'm gonna,
yeah. No, I mean,
own it. Own it and occupy it sound bad. Yeah, that's not saying I'm gonna figure out some other way.
It is. It's this, I think, and I'm joking. Obviously, I think if you did write fiction, I think it would be spectacular. Those leaps into things we cannot possibly know are, it's a lot of the reason all of us write, whether even when we are writing memoir or poetry. It's I'm not
it's so much about what you don't know. Yeah, it's so much about what you don't know. Like,
I'm not writing stuff that I already know. A textbook. That's no fun. We have a question from Rob, which is, what's something surprising or unexpected to you about comparing your own home life when you were growing up to your current home life now that you're a parent yourself?
So it's what I expected to you about comparing your own home life when you were growing up to your current home life now that you're a parent yourself. Well, like, I mean, I see a lot of parallels between, my mother's parenting. She's my model of a parent, and so with me, I try to do it a little differently. Like she would say things that were a little scary, like they were just, but jokingly. Like, her joke was like, if we were annoying her, she'd say, go out and play in the traffic. Like, that was like her like thing, and it was funny. It was funny, but now it's like, I would never say that to my daughter. I would never say, go out and play. Maybe you can get away with that in the 60s or something, but it was just like, now it's we don't really say things like that, and I'm glad we don't, but I don't feel it damaged me more than anything else, like that, her sort of she was much younger than I was as a parent too. I mean, she was also, she was 20 years old with 2 kids, and single. And so, I can't imagine what I was like at 20 years old. If I had 2 kids, like that would have been an utter disaster. I was in no shape to have to even take care of myself when I was 20.
Yeah.
So, I waited a lot longer to have kids. So, but yeah, it is. It always flashes up and we see I see glimmers of the good stuff, like just sort of like wanting to spend time with your kids, that's what I see.
It's funny because we were saying before you don't really know what the trauma of your kid's life is going to be. And I'm sure my kids will have plenty to complain about, but there's also this, I'm kind of just operating on the assumption that they'll go into the arts in some way, because that's, their genetics and it's who they seem to be. And then it's like, well, if they have this really nice, happy childhood, what on earth are they going to write about? Like, how is that going to, where's your material? I'm sure.
Well,
but
the whole world is on fire right now. So I mean, I think there's,
okay. Yeah. They can write about growing up during, lockdown. Yeah.
Yeah.
Deborah's asking, curious what issues you handle in poetry and what memoir may give you that poetry doesn't. I mean, yeah, are you, I think there's overlap in the topics you address, but there's certainly some difference too, right?
Yeah. Well, the poetry is just more, it has like even a more associative range, and you can move a lot faster. It can just leap through time and space. And you do have to do scene setting in nonfiction. You just have to. It can't be the first. When I first wrote, because I'd written a couple books of poetry before I did my first memoir, and the first draft of that, they bought it on 40 pages, and then it took me a couple of years to get them the rest of it. And when they got the first draft after those 2 years, I think they were horrified because I just wrote it as if it was like one long poem. Like Another Bullshit Night in Select City was like just one lyric moment after another lyric moment. And it was really like, and now I can recognize that it was like the equivalent of eating too much cake. It was just like, this one's really good, and this one's good. Now I'm really sick of this.
Yeah.
Like, we need to have some sort of, grounding narrative energy that sort of like locates us in time and place, lets us know where we are, like just some scene building. It's not all
yeah.
It's not all my interior life and how I'm filtering things, but we have to have the actual world come into it at some point.
You have to just have a sentence sometimes that's like, it was 1979.
Yeah. Just a straight up.
Maine. And it's not going to be a beautiful sentence. It's just not.
Yeah. But they can work though too. They can work fine, especially if you don't notice them, if they just sort of lead you into something. So
that's it. They're invisible. They're essentially
invisible. It sort of grounds the reader and gets them into something. Whereas, we read a beautiful poem by Kim Adenizio in our workshop that someone brought in called My Heart, which is totally, you can't call a poem My Heart. And then she just did this list of like crazy things of what the heart was. It just got stranger and stranger. Like it was something only poetry could do. And by the end, it was just like, it was an airplane flying toward a tower. And then, but there is no, it's like the tower. It just ended in this really odd way.
I'll have to look this up. Wow.
Yeah, called My Heart by Kim Adenizio. It's a great list poem that, it just takes the abstraction of the heart and then just sort of like makes it weirder and weirder as it goes through it.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and you couldn't really do that. That would be too much. That'd be enough for a whole book of, a memoir.
Yeah. Well, you can sustain, and this is one of the reasons I'm always telling fiction readers to read short stories. Then, we can work on them with the poetry later, but there are experiments of subject and form and thought, and that you could not sustain for a novel. That would be obnoxious, right? But that you can have a one-page, a Lydia Davis story that is a letter to a funeral parlor, or a list story. If you only read long form, you're missing a significant amount of what fiction can do. And similarly, if you're missing if you're not reading poetry, you're missing these things that would not be feasible in.
Yeah. They I mean, the genres are breaking down, but there are definitely some things that are much more, like, short flash fiction, much more, poetry. Like, there's no way that we could mistake the Comeditio for anything but a poem.
Right.
Like, it
Right.
just couldn't. It couldn't be done in another thing. It just wouldn't fit in another form. Like, what happens at the end of that poem? Someone wrote, one of my writers wrote in the end of it, no lights on the runway. That was part of it. Yeah. Part of the end of it.
Cool. Okay, I have to find this. Oh my God.
It's her heart. Her heart is like no lights on the runway. It's like, okay, like.
Oh my God, that's amazing. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask you Heather's question and then get back up to Colby's question, because Colby's is a really good one to end on. So
Okay.
Heather's question is, with writing memoir, how do you handle sharing your story with the people you know well, family, friends, relatives, as opposed to the greater reading world?
Yeah, that's great. And I wish I could say, like, I could have said, like, a few years ago, I think I probably, like, have pushed my luck too far, because, like, my first couple memoirs, I was like, everything's kind of okay, everyone's cool with it. And now it's getting, the deeper you go and the sort of longer you live, like, things get more complicated. And now this one it's a complicated book. I mean, this is a complicated book, and everything in it, anyone who is in the book, knew everything first. It wasn't like, this isn't like, oh, I'm going to surprise you with, like, what I'm writing about.
Right.
Like, everything was worked out in a much deeper way in reality than in the book. The difficulties with the marriage, I can't say that about with my daughter. She doesn't know everything in the book.
Right.
And that's like, yeah. And I address it to her. I addressed the book to her at the end, like the last chapter of the book is to her. It's like a letter to her, and just sort of like asking her to, like, and I have a feeling though, but my sense of with a kid though, and I think with anyone you're close to, they all know it anyway. I mean, they can all sense what's going on with you anyway. They, I don't think anything in this, I don't think anything in this book, she would read and be like, that you were going through that. I mean, she was with me in Florida when I'm, like, breaking a stick over my leg and, like sort of losing my mind, and she's sort of, and now I'm not, now I sort of got through that time, and so she can see all that. So, but thanks, Deborah, for asking that.
Yeah, I like that. And then the last question here that we'll get to is from Colby, which is, are thinking about where your work is heading? Are you working on anything? Do you think there's something that compels you toward poetry versus prose at a given moment? So answer both of those, but the sort of, what are you writing next, is always a nice one to go out on.
Colby's great. Colby's a great writer. She's a fiction writer that I've worked with a lot in Houston, PhD fiction writer, and she's doing an amazing book, and we had fun working on it this last year. So what, let me just look at the question again. Like, I know it's between work is heading. I am working on something now. I've been working on poems for the last year or so. It took a little while to get back into writing, maybe not so long, but I just sort of, a lot of work had just come out. And then I've been doing this series of poems based on these collages that I do. I make these collages, and I was doing this sort of meditative practice where I'd look at the collage and then I'd meditate on it. I'd put it face down and sort of write it from memory and what I remember in the collage. The collage always had things going on in it, like little scenes and stuff. It wasn't just like colors and images, there were little scenes of things going on, like little photographs or little paintings or something. So like 3 little scenes that juxtaposed. And so I'd write about them and just sort of try to find like something in those. So I just have done a whole series of those, and I'm just sort of still working on them though. Like, and I'm in no real great rush with them. I haven't sent anything out yet or shown anything. I think I've read some. I've read some at different venues, but not much though. And that's kind of it right now. I'm kind of happy with that. Like, working on these poems. So, and I don't know. And so right now, what's compelling me, maybe I just finished a big prose book, and I just don't want to get into like another big prose book. I mean, I think you know that, Rebecca. Like, I think there's a healthy resistance to like getting into a project. I know you're in a project now. You're in a project, but I'm not, and I'm kind of very happy not to be in like a big, long project because it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of your life. So
there's a lot of just kind of the thing that you just did, whatever it was, kind of like, I don't want to do that ever again.
yeah.
You know, with me, it's always every book that involves research. Then I'm like, I don't want to write any research. I'm just going to write about my own office next time. And then it ends up being research heavy anyway. But there's that sort of, and then you forget and then you're ready. But the thing that was so laborious, I think there's something, which it all is, there's something about feeling like, okay, it's done and this is not my job tomorrow, you know?
Yeah. It's a wild feeling, when it's like suddenly done. And then, so it's nice to just sort of creep back into poetry and just like, because poetry has it's just a totally different mind frame. It's like, I can do it literally in an hour a day and I'm just done. And then I'm done for the whole day. It's like, you know, my work is done. If I did an hour a day on poetry, I would be, you know, I'd be working full time. Whereas that, if you did an hour a day in like a memoir or fiction, like you're never going to finish.
It takes, well, I mean, that's why it does take years, but even, that would take you many years. That's,
So,
oh, excellent. Well, okay, so, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just been enjoying being like just alive outside of a book right now. So,
seriously.
Oh, let's just read this last line of Kim Inizio. It's here from Natasha Williams. That landing strip. So this is called My Heart. This is the last couple lines of My Heart by Kim Inizio. That landing strip with no runway lights, where you are aiming your plane, imagining a voice in the tower, imagining a tower.
That's wild. I love her. She's, oh my God. There's sort of a, I always feel like, you know, kind of socked in the stomach by her work. And that's a good feeling, you know, I mean, metaphorically. Well, I want to, first of all, thank you so much and thank Exile and Bookville so much for doing this, and to remind everyone that they can click the book buying links and support not only Nick and his work, but also a great new indie bookstore that we want to keep thriving.
Thanks, Rebecca. You just did my outro for me. No, but really, thank you, Nick and Rebecca, for such a wonderful conversation. I feel like it could have gone on for a lot longer, and we're very grateful to both of you for allowing Exile to host you. And thank you to everyone who showed up tonight. This event was recorded, so if you missed it or you want to go back to it, you can visit our website, where you can also purchase Nick's memoir, This Is the Night Our House Will Catch Fire, with an awesome signed bookplate, and of course, Rebecca's The Great Believers. So again, thank you, Nick and Rebecca, so much. And thank you, everyone. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Nick, I hope it cools down a little bit more there, just like in Chicago. It's terrible here.
Yeah. Soon. Thanks.
Soon it will be fall.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Exile.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.